Good morning, everyone. I hope your Labor Day weekend went on smoothly and it was okay. You were able to have some fun and keep yourselves safe as always. First of all, for today's background, I want to thank Kenneth for sending his idea. So I don't know what that is, I'm sorry. But thanks for sharing with us some artwork so we can actually have something interesting in the back. All right, let's move on. Today we're going to start talking about the theory of liberalism. But as always, let's start with the normal quick review. So on Thursday, I completed a discussion about material theories by reiterating some of the main points related to neorealism, focusing mostly on the security dilemma, which in the vast majority of cases stems from arms races when states decide to expand their security by going into some kinds of arms race. So actually they face a dilemma because they know that by expanding their own security, they're leading to a feeling of insecurity among their adversaries, and that creates a dilemma because overall that might lead them to have lower level of security over the long run. And that leads to many different aspects related to the risks from offensive military expansion and how that might lead to war eventually. Then I switched gears and talked about another material theory, power transition theory, some of the clear distinctions of that theory from the realist point of views, a world which is not an anarchic worldview, but actually is based on a hierarchy. So there's one dominant state which decides the rules of the game, that's what's called. It controls the rules of the game, the way that states should behave, the important role that the status quo plays. So it's not just power in this case. So that's some states are accepting the status quo, and that's part of the explanation why there is war under power transition theory and why there's not. The role of relative power, some states are stronger than others because there's hierarchy. So there's a couple of clusters of states. The dominant power is the most powerful state in the system, and can be challengers, so states that accumulates more power and tries to compare its own power to the main actor in the system. And that's where the other factor comes into play, and that's the satisfy and dissatisfy state. So it can be a situation where the most powerful state in the system has almost an equal another state, but if that another state is satisfied, then there's no likelihood of war, according to that theory. On the other hand, when a challenger is dissatisfied with status quo and it generates enough power to be almost equal, then this is the power transition period, if you remember the terminology, then the war is more likely. And because it's a war that is on the control of the rules and the conduct in the international system, it's likely to be a very costly war. Then I finished with giving you some very quick glimpse on public views of a realist perception. How much does the public really portray those kinds of views? And based on the experiments and the survey work that Kurtzer and McGraw did, we saw that there are some specific individual traits that are the foundations for people who are more likely to express those kinds of realist views. So more conservative, more militaristic. And that was part of a couple of the examples. And then we saw how much does those kinds of views translate to policy preferences. So realist individuals tend to persist in those views even when they don't have a lot of information on the situation they face, and the role that negative emotions have here in amplifying those kinds of views. So those were some of the main findings related to public perceptions and realist views. If you have any questions in that context, you're more than welcome, as always, to email me. All right, so today we're going to shift the discussion from the material theories, such as realism or power transition theory, and we explore the theory of liberalism. I'll start, as usual, with the background, talk a little bit about the basics of liberal views, and some of its distinctions from the material views, and its implications for international relations. So Liberal theories emerge as a counterweight to the rise of the neo-realist approach in the late 1970s, early 1980s. In contrast to those realist perspectives, the focus of the real liberal point of view is international cooperation and not competition between states. So it's not the struggle for power, but that's the pursuit of cooperation among actors in the international system. From a structural standpoint, liberalism embraces the role of the hierarchical structure of the international system, with one actor that's supposed to enforce the rules. The emphasis on cooperation also suggests that the interest that any actors have in gaining absolute gains rather than relative gains. Remember, I talked about in the realist point of view that relative gains is one of the important aspects of the theory. So in this case, this is absolute gains and not relative ones. One of the central work, which is the one you had reading for today, is Moravcik's paper. He presented the foundations of a realist theory. He describes it in a way that is intended to be scientific theory. One of the important things that he had to do, one of his important objectives in his work, is to present a theory, a liberal theory, which is not necessarily is going to be seen as kind of an idealist point of view, a utopian world which does not exist. He wanted to ground those those theoretical frameworks in clear scientific tools. So he used core assumptions, and providing a lot more scientific credence for those kinds of views. And you see this quote that I had here from the paper that emphasizes the liberal theory, emphasizes the role of state-society relations and how is the relations between society within the states is important effect on the behavior state of the international politics and the global politics. And that already gives us a hint to the distinctions of that theory from the material realist point of view. Places a lot more on the society, the state-society relations as a powerful factor that shapes the behavior on the international scale. And that's going to lead me to, let's talk a little bit about distinctions between the liberal point of view and the realist point of view that we talked about so far. So the first one I've mentioned already, liberalism embraces the idea of a hierarchy is the central organizing principle of the international system. So there is a global hegemonic power which is intended to enforce the norms of conduct, maintain the regimes, and we'll talk exactly what it is, the regimes, I'll talk about it in a few minutes, and preserve the stability and the international peace between nations. So that's one contrast. So there's hegemonic power, hierarchical system, and not anarchic system, which is a clear distinction from realism. The other important distinction in this case is the focus on state preferences is driving the outcome. So instead of looking at the means, which is the strategic condition, the strategic constraints based on the system that drive the behavior of states, it's actually the behavior of states in the international system. It is actually the state's preferences, the demands of members of society and members of the public that drives the behavior of the state of the international system. And I'll get to more details about that in a few minutes. But first, what this kind of argument leads to is it can lead critics of liberal theory to argue, well, if state behavior in the international system is based on factors which are within the state, because state preferences are internal, then it's not really a system level theory. It's not a system type theory, like all the theories we've talked about so far. Now, one of the counter arguments for that, can be a couple of counter arguments for that. So the first one, you see it here, states preferences can be a reflection of global, transnational, societal preferences. For example, some cultural values which go beyond national borders. So some of the values of the Western society, for example, are shared by the United States and Great Britain and other nations in Western Europe, in Eastern Europe, in Israel, and other states. So there are values which transcend national borders, and that may mean that the state preferences actually reflect the global preferences. So it is a system-based factor. The second argument in this case is that the behavior of each state in the international system depends on its own state preferences, but it also depends on the configuration of preferences of other states in the system. So in that sense, the behavior of state is a better reflection of what's called a rational choice if we look at rational choice in the most pure economic sense of it, because behavior is based on preferences and not capabilities. In the realist point of view, the behavior is a rational behavior based on capabilities. In the liberal point of view, this is a behavior based on preferences. And if you go back to economic theory, the basics of economic theory, then one of the important parts of it is that rational behavior is based on individual preferences. So that's part of the some of the counter arguments that Moravcsik is presenting against arguing that a liberal theory does not fit a system type theory. All right, so let's look at the main assumption, because as I stated already, one of the important roles that he wanted to do was to use core assumptions as the foundations of the theory to make sure it doesn't appear as kind of an idealist point of view, but actually a systematic scientific theory. First is liberal theory is based on a bottom-up view, which means the individual preferences of demands of individuals and groups within society, they are the drivers of behavior. Those demands which are rational, as I talked about in the previous slide, they are aggregated, advanced through the official political process and collective action by individuals, which means that the demands of each individual in society is aggregated. For democratic states, for example, this aggregation process, the clearest example for an aggregation process is just elections. You choose your representative based whether they are reflecting your preferences. So this is the drivers of state behavior, the individual preferences which come from the public and from different groups within society. Now, individuals pursuing different preferences the purpose of those preferences is the material and ideal welfare of members of society. Those demands are a function of the fact that there are scarce resources within society. They compel individuals to behave in a way which is self-interest and risk-averse manner. Again, all of this comes back to the idea of not presenting a utopian point of view about why individuals have certain demands, certain preferences. There are scarce resources. So we have to take some bargaining or some constraints on our behavior. And that's, again, that's one of the important arguments that are made in order to ground that theory in a very clear and obvious assumptions in this case. Okay, so that's the first assumption. Second one, related to that, the state is not an independent abstract actor, unitary actor, the way it was presented by realist theories in this case. Instead, it's a representing institution of the different coalition of social actors, of social preferences. So the government policy, the behavior of the government and the international system is constrained in that level by the underlying identities and interests of individuals and groups who constantly pressure the main decision makers to pursue policies which consisted with their preferences, because there's a lot of different identities within society. Then the members of society are pushing for different policies, and that serves as a constraint on the type of policy that the state can implement, even at an international scale in this case. And once again, one of the things that Moravcsik keeps on doing is avoiding a utopian view. He argues that there's no universal equal representation of all preferences. The government represents some groups more than others. So it's not a utopian ideal point of view where all groups of society are equally represented and that's the behavior of the state. No, some groups are dominant over the others from different reasons. That's not the point of the assumption in this case, and that affects the behavior. Finally, the third assumption places the state back into the international system. The idea is that states are based, the behavior of states in the international system is based on the individual preferences of its different members of society, different groups, and systems and states are trying to implement those kinds of preferences within their policies in the international system, but they must operate within the constraints of the system because other countries, other states are also trying to implement their own preferences, their own policies. So there's got to be some kind of constraints on how much of those preferences of my members of my society I'm actually able to implement. All right, I'm going to go to the next part of this presentation of the theory, talking about the two main elements of liberal theory. The first one is social norms. Norms are one of the central principles of the liberal perspective. Think about norms as the fact that in some cases, when these are kinds of conducts of behavior that are accepted. For example, if you go and look for a bus here in university area before everything that's happened over the last year when the world was still normal, in many cases, when you get to a bus stop, you don't just go and step into the bus if there are people there and you form a line. One of the things for me as a person coming from the outside the United States, one of the amazing things for me to see was that sometimes there is a line formed waiting for the bus, even when the bus is not there. And this is based, one of the ideas behind that, on some social norms. You don't just go and step whatever you want, you stand in line waiting for the bus. That's just one example from Texas A&M University, but you can see that, of course, across, especially in Texas, it's very common. And the pictures that you have in the slides is another example for that. Now, don't take the location of those pictures as any kind of judgment I have. In case I just happen to find a picture here from one of the subway systems here in the US that can be either New York or San Francisco, I'm not sure. The other one is from a train system somewhere, I think it's in East Asia, I think it's India. It's not representative of everything, but one of the social norms that exist when you go and ride the train, for example, if you want to go on the train, you first let the people get off the train before you go on inside the train. That's one of the accepted norms. And some cases it's more implemented than others, but that's one of the ideas. And that's one of the examples. It's not a law. It's not something that anybody codified or set in stone. It's just a norm that's accepted in society. So let's talk a little bit more in details. What are norms? So they are respected or accepted patterns of behavior, accepted globally as modes of conduct which are expected and which are accepted among many different actors. They serve as an informal means which do not have the official force of laws to back them up. And they tend to encourage behavior which is, again, accepted by the different elements in the system. As an example, think about the fact that states tend to respect the territorial boundaries of other states and do not invade into other states in the vast majority of cases. So there is no clear wall between the United States and Canada in the vast majority of the northern border. I haven't been there in the border itself, but I'm guessing that in most cases there's no clear physical barrier in this case. And we still do not see vast invasions of Canadian into the northern United States, and at the same time you don't see vast invasions of Americans into the southern border of Canada, because some of the norms accepted in this case is that we respect the territorial boundaries of international states. That's just one example. Cultural norms and values, which is close to norms in that case, also promote cooperation by demonstrating that disrespect for those norms is not acceptable, is not accepted, and that lead to sanctions, this punishment based on violations of those norms. And this is where the assumption of a hierarchic system, which has one dominant power, is important, because we need a powerful enough actor to actually enforce this kind of sanction on the violators of the norm. So that's an important part. But again, norms are one of the important aspects of the international system, according to the liberal point of view. I want to talk about the dynamic nature of global norms. So norms tend to change with time and experience. Those changes tend to drive different patterns of international interactions between the different actors. Since norms are not codified rules, they should be on some level easier to change and evolve over time, even though at the same time I would argue that because norms on some level are based on a change or a process of social change, it might even take longer for norms to be revised or altered over time. So it's not necessarily that norms will change faster than rules. From a procedural standpoint, norms should be easier to change because they don't face any kind of the need to go through any kind of specific procedures, but they're mostly patterns of behavior within society. Now, a couple of examples for the changing norms in our small context of the international relations area. For example, today we have pretty accepted global norms that oppose political assassination or targeting political leaders. There are rules for that, even though, again, on some cases it's more than others. The United States have enforced a lot of targeting political leaders or leaders of their adversaries in the world of terrorism. Or Israel also implemented this kind of policies, but overall, it's especially from a normative standpoint or a norm standpoint, this is prohibited. But in the Middle Ages, this was a legitimate warfare tactics. So this kind of norm, which was very legitimate a couple of hundred years ago, has changed over time into being illegitimate today. Another example is the behavior toward the POWs, prisoners of war. So today, there is no clear norms that reject what's called ransoming POWs for money. But in the 14th and 15th century, it was acceptable. It was even considered humane in some cases to exchange prisoners of war for money. So again, that's another norm, an accepted global pattern of behavior that's changed over time. The third example that I have for you is related to torture and looking at the societal point of view. How do people view the use of torture of prisoners of war in this case, or suspects of any kind of violations in the context of international relations? So in the 12th century, the Catholic Church viewed torture as a means to save souls. Okay, I'll take that. During the good old days of the late 12th century and early 13th century, it was a legitimate, efficient, and in some cases even progressive way to fight crime, to torture those criminals. Today, we are less accepting of torture, or actually are not accepting torture, especially in democratic countries and among democratic population. Think about the outcry that was here in the United States over the events that happened in the Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq in the early 2000s during the war. Think about the criticism over the American government's interrogation tactics as part of the war with Iraq. I want to expand a little bit on that by showing you some results from a survey that was conducted a couple of years ago as part of a research. So what you see here is survey questions in terms of public support for different interrogation and detention techniques. And overall, without going into the details of this specific study and this specific, and I'll give you some context in a second, we see that the vast majority of people are opposing to harsh tactics of interrogation, which are including on some level torture, because holding the suspect's head underwater is torture on some level. So overall, even you can see that there's not low, there's a pretty substantial numbers that oppose tactics that relate to detention. So it's not even interrogation of suspects, it's just detention. For example, not allowing the suspect to meet with a lawyer is drawing a vast or pretty substantial amount of opposition from the people that answered this specific survey. Now, I want to qualify that and put this results, specific results within context. This is part of a study that's focused on attitudes to torture in the context of terrorism. It compared different types of terrorism, especially focusing on their ethnic origin, comparing Islamic terrorists with white supremacists. And so the results were unrelated to our discussion or tangentially related to our discussion, but I wanted to show you just recent data showing how much there is opposition here in the United States, for example, for the implementation of torture in the context of international security. So it was just intended to show an additional example for a norm that was accepted in the past. Today, it's not accepted in almost any context. Whenever informal norms are unsuccessful in leading to the desired behavior and the resolve of any kind of dispute, especially in the international context, because that's what we're talking about here, they're usually backed by formal and codified laws of conduct, which in many cases fit definition of international regimes. International regimes are a set of international, in some cases, international laws, or in other cases, this is international organizations. Some of them you have here on this picture. So you have a lot of the organizations related to the United Nations. Some of them are also including the World Bank, the IMF, the World Health Organization here on top. So those are kind of examples for a couple of institutions, international institutions which fit this international regimes definition. So international regimes from a formal definition standpoint, so it's international laws or rules, organizations are mostly designed to promote coordination among actors, and those actors have shared interests. So those are sets of organizations or laws that promote cooperation, intended to join the norms and facilitate this cooperation in the pursuit of the natural inclination by states based on their individual publics, the pursuit to maximize their wealth, the pursuit of wealth. So those states, instead of pursuing power, they're pursuing wealth. And those norms, along with the global international regimes, are intended to facilitate cooperative behavior between those different nations in order to expand the wealth of everyone. That's the foundations of that. International regimes promote the importance of ideas by emphasizing how those ideas are spread, but also by highlighting the reputational cost for violation of those norms. A critical component of that is international law. So international laws fit into the global regimes context and not to the norms side of it. They serve as an important constraint on behavior, and they have an effect, of course, in the short term. The long term, in many cases, international laws are defined to look at improving the overall welfare of all nations in the long term, which means that in many cases, as my dissertation will tell you, also have negative short-term outcomes. So there may be costs in the short term or negative implications in the short term, but it's intended to show a long-term benefits to all those that abide by the rule, by the international law over the long run. And that's relate, of course, that's part of the foundation of liberalism, and that's related to some of the arguments related to studies of behavior between individuals. Those kinds of formal theory studies focus on cooperation, and they show that in the long term, cooperative behavior is more beneficial because there's mutual gains for both actors which engage in this cooperation. think about it in the context. I don't want to go into details about studying cooperation in the temporal perspective because that's unrelated to our discussion. Just one foundation of this argument. But if you are familiar with the prisoner's dilemma, think about it in the long-term context of not a single shot between two actors in a prisoner's dilemma, but multiple games between those actors. If you want to talk about it a little bit more, you're welcome to come talk to me about it during office hours. We can go into details about a multiple iteration game of the prisoner's dilemma, but that's not the point we talk about. I talked about international regimes. That's what I want to keep talking about now. So let's think about a couple of examples. This is what's called the BBB. This is the Better Business Bureau, sorry. It's kind of a modern day regime. It does not have the power of a codified law, but it's a very powerful tool. It's a very powerful organization that is fighting to expose violations of market behavior. So it is intended to expose violations of agreed patterns of behavior. There's some forms of behavior which are expected within the marketplace, within the international business environment, and within the local business environment. And by raising the threat of exposing those kinds of violations, it increases much higher level of compliance. It is a compliance which is based on those threats of exposing the violators and not compulsory because it's based on the law. So the mere threat of exposure in this case is sufficient to induce compliance by the various businesses. So that's just one example for an organization, which is an example for an international regime. Another example for that, so there's trade agreements or trade regimes. Those are agreements and relevant institutions that are intended to regulate and enforce certain trade policies. So NAFTA is intended to enforce a trade policy between Canada, the United States, and Mexico. Those are tools to foster cooperation among those participants, even though in most cases, as NAFTA is one of those cases, there is pretty clear asymmetry in the relative gains or in the relative power between those participants. So there is clear asymmetry between Canada and Mexico and the United States in the relative gains, the relative power, the relative economic power, the relative military power. But this is the idea behind this trade regime, is that intent is that those laws, those rules, those institutions are intended to foster the cooperation, even though there is not equal actors. That's part of the idea. Okay, I want to talk about one of the most prominent liberal theories of international relations, and that's the theory of interdependence. The theory of interdependence was proposed by, introduced by two famous scholars, Robert Keohane and Joseph Nye, in the late 1970s, about the same time that the neorealist point of view was also presented a little bit before Walt's book. The focus of this theory, you can see that in those 2 points that I already have here, as a counter to the realist point of view, is focusing the discussion of international relations on political economy, so the economic relations between states, rather than security affairs. From an implementation of a theory standpoint, it means that the variables that those kinds of theories focus on are not the realist values or variables in this case, such as the distribution of power or power configurations, but rather the distributions of shared interests, which are based on cultural norms, based on international regimes, and policies such as trade. So the distribution of shared interest between members of the system, that's what drives this theory within the overall context of liberal theory, rather than their power relations, their power configurations, their pursuit of security, and those kinds of factors that were proposed by the realist point of view. The link of the specific state preferences, which drives the behavior, with the way that other countries behave and the policies that they pursue, is promoted or based on the concept of policy interdependence. Policy interdependence is the costs and benefits that states face when all states try to implement their own preferences, that creates what's called here, as you can see, transnational externalities, which are constraints on global behavior. And I've mentioned that beforehand, the fact that every state tries to implement its own policy, which is based on its own preferences, means there's some bargaining, there's some push and pull, and there are some, and all of that represent constraints on the type of policies that states are able to implement in the international system. The patterns of interdependence, or the links of interdependence to conflictual behavior, fit three overall patterns. So the links between interdependence of states in the context of liberal theory and the possibility or the likelihood of conflict between those states are based on three different patterns. When the preferences of states are fitting, are compatible, that's what's called optimal externalities, then coordination between states in the context of their behavior is much easier, and the likelihood of conflict is very, very low. At the same time, when the preferences fit what's called the zero-sum pattern, so if I am able to accomplish my preferences, that means you're able to accomplish nothing, there is substantial cost imposed on other members of the international system. As a result, it creates sort of a bargaining game between actors, which does not include mutual gains, because my gains are your losses. There's no mutual gains for both of us in that context. So the likelihood of tensions and conflicts is much higher. As an example, think about what's called revisionist preferences. Think about Nazi Germany. Nazi Germany has its own preferences way back in the 1930s. They tried to push for that, and the acceptance of those preferences in the international system way back in the 1930s meant that the other states we do not have those preferences had nothing, and that led eventually to conflict. And you can see that as one way to interpret the escalation leading to the Second World War in the late 1930s, based on unfitting preferences between the different actors. Now, the third option is when motives are mixed, then states realize that concessions and bargaining through coordination is the better path to increase the wealth, increase the overall wealth of all members of the system. Instead of engaging in a unilateral action, states should cooperate, and they have incentives for policy coordination that increase the welfare for all members of the system. So those are the three patterns of interdependence and how they link to international conflict. Before I go into the final points of discussion today, I want to stop for a minute to talk about the attendance word for today. The attendance word for today is goodbye. Goodbye again. Don't forget to insert your name when you fill in the form and the correct date of today. I'll finish up the discussion today with another example for some sort of a variant of the liberal theory in the international context, and that's commercial theory, trade. This is a variant of the liberal theory. It's focused on market incentives that are created by opportunities for trans-border economic transaction. This is a view of free trade which stresses the interaction between aggregated preferences and different obstacles that states face. And the market structure in this case is a very important element, and that creates incentives for some states to pursue policies that open their economies, and in other states, in other cases, those states have incentives to close the access to their economies. So that's the idea behind those aggregate preferences, again, obstacles, and that's how that leads. The basic formulation of the idea of commerce and trade within the liberal theory is that changes in the structure of the domestic as well as the global economy alter the cost and benefits that are derived of those transnational economic exchanges, and they may create pressures on domestic governments to engage in policies that either facilitate or block those kinds of economic transactions, and lead to different kinds of benefits for members of the society. So that's the basic idea behind that. The argument in this case is that the structure of the international system within the context of the liberal theory provides incentives for growing the overall welfare of members of the international system, and that's push for a much more liberal economic policy, which means, in essence, means free trade and fewer restrictions. And whenever we raise the point of free trade, we have to talk about the other side of it, and I'm going to talk about it now briefly because I want to talk about it as an example in the context of liberal theory. We'll talk about it much more in detail when we get to the week that talks about a political economy in a few weeks, but I do want to mention a few points about it. So whenever we talk about trade theory in the context of liberal principles, one of the counter arguments, as always, is protectionism or protection policies. This picture that you have here is from a recent, I think it's the Economist article that talks about the patterns or the trends of protection policies when it comes to information technology within different states. As you can see here, they got the United States, China, and the European Union. Each one of them are shifting towards a more protectionist kinds of policy in the context of information technology. And was the essence of the article. But let's talk about the free trade versus protection policies point of view. So free trade, in essence, promotes an increase in the aggregated welfare. And that's based on the economic principles of specialization and functional differentiation. The idea behind it in the most abstract economic theory is that countries which have sectors that they are specializing in, for example, the United States has the relative advantage, it specializes in information technology, should produce mostly this kind of product. So the United States should have most of its economy, should focus its economy on some levels on information technology as one example. At the same time, an economy such as China or other countries in the Far East like India have the relative advantage from strictly economic standpoint in a sector such as labor. So labor should transfer into this country, which will emphasize it as part of his economic behavior. Now, this is a very abstract point of view because then the idea is that information technologies should flow into the United States as part of free trade and labor will shift to the Far East. If we look at just this specific interaction between two actors. Now, on some level, we see that a lot of sectors such as manufacturing and textile have moved over the last 20 years or so to the Far East where they have this relative advantage, and information technology is highly developed in the Western world, the United States. Israel has a very relatively large sector for that. And that means that when this kind of dynamics is operating properly, then the overall welfare of all the members of the system should be higher. Now, in reality, it's not exactly like that. It's a lot more complicated than that. And one of the counter arguments to this free trade argument and the overall benefits of free trade is related to what's called domestic distributional conflicts. And that's when the cost, but mostly the benefits of a national policy such as liberal free trade are not internalized equally among consumers. So not all members of the American public are gaining equally from free trade because people in the information technology sectors may be benefiting from higher salaries because of free trade, because of specialization of the United States in this sector, but members of manufacturing are suffering because they lost their job. So they don't gain the same benefits as the ones who are engaging in other sectors. Now, this kind of inequality creates incentives for some sectors, in most cases, those sectors led by their representatives, by their unions, to push policymakers and to encourage policies that would generate personal benefits for those sectors at the expense of aggregate welfare. So those kinds of protection policies on manufacturing, on textile, on agriculture are intended to provide benefits to members of those sectors because they are unable to materialize the benefits from free trade for international trade. And those kinds of policies are in many cases the economic argument state is at the expense of better welfare for the entire population. So in other words, this kind of behavior is much more likely for sectors which are defined as non-competitive and undiversified, and they tend to suffer the most from free trade. They have the most incentive to oppose that and create pressures for protectionist policy. An example for that, again, is agriculture. When agriculture cannot compete with lower prices, lower labor, cheaper labor in other countries, that creates incentives for those groups to pressure the national government to enforce protectionist policies, such as the one that we have here in the United States over the last couple of years, with kinds of policies of tariff policies on agriculture, which also force the government, in order to compensate for the losses of farmers, to compensate them with subsidies, which is a different point of view and a different type of angle of this policy. But the money given to subsidies, you can argue, could have gone to other places for education, for national defense. So overall welfare of the system is not better because of those protectionist policies. And that's the argument in this case. And that's part, again, that's just a 5-7 minutes discussion about the free trade and protectionism policies within the liberal theory framework, and how all of that is actually based on some of those liberal ideas of cooperation between states in order to increase the welfare, the shared interest of them. The final point which Moravchik talks about is that he fits in the final paper, in the final pages of his paper, he fits the liberal theory into a general theory of IR that intended to explain behavior. And if you read the paper, you came across this figure, I'm pretty sure. He proposes this two-stage model that explains state behavior as a constrained social choice. The idea is that states begin with defining their preferences based on the aggregation of social preferences, using different domestic institution and political process. That leads to this part here of the state preferences aggregated. And at the same time, there are also other factors that affect the behavior of states. And those are what we know from previous weeks, the realist factors. Mostly I'll put the institutional factors aside for now because we're not talking about it so much. And that's the distribution of powers and distribution of capabilities. Now, eventually, those two factors work together, according to his argument, according to his model of state behavior, to affect the strategic interaction phase, which is the phase in which states bargain with other states in the international system as part of the international relations and the way that states behave in the international system. Now, the argument, again, that he adds here is that this side of the figure is what we had so far until we started our discussion today about liberalism. The idea is that liberal factors shape state preferences and their foundations are within the states and they affect the interaction itself. So it's the combination of effects from the international sphere, the realist factors, along with the domestic factors. And that's part of the argument, and that's actually different variations of this model are one of the most common ways to view state behavior in IR today. Now, this view that this figure and the final arguments that Moravchik proposes places us much closer to exploring the effects of internal factors within states. What are the factors that drive those states' preferences and how they shape international behavior? So how those internal factors here leads to the outcomes in the international spectrum. And this is the focus of our discussion for Thursday. We will begin looking into the black box of nation states. We'll actually shift our level of analysis from the system level of analysis that we've talked about so far and going into the nation state level of analysis, understanding how the domestic factors within states impact the behavior of states in the international system. If you want to read more, as always, there's different variations of the Hiohane argument about liberalism and interdependence in this first article. A recent work by Erika Owen, who was a former faculty member in our university here. And I also added here a link if you are interested in from a recent piece in the Monkey Cage blog from the Washington Post about NAFTA, which I talked a little bit today about as one example for international regime. Of course, this is recommended readers. You're not required to read that. The Monkey Cage link is a short one, so maybe that's going to give you some incentives to go ahead and read that. One of the benefits that I will encourage you to go and read a lot of the pieces that are available on the Monkey Cage blog is that it tries to use a real world example and show how the different political theories, international, not always, but international relations, political science theories are applied in reality. So that's my recommendation in that case. That's it for me for today. So thank you again for sending me those pictures for the background. You are highly encouraged to keep doing that. And we will talk later this week. Bye-bye, everyone.